World War II gave us some of the most persistent tank myths in military history. Even today, decades after the war ended, people still believe in the invincible Tiger tank, the Sherman that burned like a Ronson lighter, and the supposed inferiority of Soviet armor. But what does the evidence actually tell us? The truth is far more complicated and far more interesting than the legends. If you're curious about real military history and want to separate fact from fiction, subscribe to the channel. We're diving deep into 3 of the biggest tank myths from the Second World War, and by the end, you'll understand why popular belief and historical reality are often worlds apart. Let's start with the Tiger tank, arguably the most famous tank of the entire war. For decades, the Tiger has been portrayed as a nearly unstoppable juggernaut. Stories emerged of single Tigers holding off entire platoons of Allied tanks. Soldiers who faced them spoke in hushed tones about their invincibility. This legend grew so powerful that even now, people cite the Tiger as proof of German engineering superiority. But here's where we need to pump the brakes. The Tiger tank was genuinely impressive. Its armor was thick, its gun was powerful, and its optics were excellent. No question there. However, the myth vastly overstates its actual impact on the battlefield. The numbers tell a different story. The Germans built only around 2,500 Tigers during the entire war. Compare that to the Soviets, who manufactured over 35,000 T-34 tanks. The Americans built nearly 50,000 Shermans. The Tiger was a heavy tank, expensive to produce, and required skilled maintenance. It couldn't be mass-produced the way Allied tanks were. More importantly, the Tiger's armor, while thick, had some serious vulnerabilities. Experienced Allied crews learned that hitting the sides and rear was often more effective than frontal assault. The gun was formidable, yes, but many Tiger crews lacked proper training as the war progressed. Here's something crucial that feeds the myth. Successful Tiger ambushes became legendary because they were relatively rare and dramatic. One Tiger destroying multiple Allied tanks in a coordinated ambush got remembered and repeated. The far more common scenario, where a Tiger was flanked, ambushed from behind, or engaged by multiple enemies simultaneously, didn't produce the same dramatic narrative. Survivors tell the exciting stories. The dead don't tell any stories at all. When you account for loss ratios and actual combat effectiveness, the Tiger was formidable, but far from invincible. German commanders knew this. They never treated Tigers as magical weapons. They treated them as valuable but specialized assets that required proper support and tactical deployment. Now let's tackle the second great myth, the Sherman tank and the Ronson lighter claim. This one has become absolutely iconic in popular culture. The idea is that the Sherman was so prone to catching fire that it was nicknamed the Ronson, after the lighter company's slogan. According to the legend, American tankers knew their Shermans were death traps. They called them Ronson tanks. This myth persists so strongly that even modern documentaries sometimes repeat it as established fact. But here's the problem. There's almost no contemporary evidence that this nickname was actually used during the war. Researchers have searched extensively through period military documents, letters, diaries, and interviews with actual Sherman crews. The term simply doesn't appear. It shows up later, in post-war accounts, particularly in books written decades after the war ended. The myth seems to have emerged and grown over time, gaining authority through repetition rather than documentation. Now, were Shermans prone to fire? Yes, somewhat more than ideal. They used gasoline engines initially, and their ammunition storage could be problematic. But here's the context that matters. Most tanks of that era were vulnerable to fire. The T-34 burned. The Panther burned. The Tiger burned. It was a feature of tank warfare in the 1940s. The Sherman actually had several advantages that counters the narrative. It was far more reliable mechanically than German tanks. American crews could get replacement parts and trained maintenance support. The Sherman's ease of manufacture meant crews could be replaced when damaged rather than losing irreplaceable veterans. Most importantly for crew survival, American tanks had better ergonomics and faster turret traverse, meaning crews could engage enemies more quickly. In tank-on-tank combat, speed and accuracy mattered tremendously. The Sherman's practical advantages often outweighed the Tiger's raw power. Shermans were built by the tens of thousands. They were everywhere. They could be produced quickly, repaired easily, and crewed by soldiers who had access to training and support. What really happened is that German heavy tanks, particularly the Tiger and Panther, did have impressive statistics in certain engagements. Allied tankers respected them. In some cases, facing a Tiger or Panther in a Sherman was genuinely dangerous. But the danger wasn't universal inevitability. It was tactical. A Sherman engaging from the side or rear could kill a heavy tank with ease. Multiple Shermans working together could flank and overwhelm heavier opposition. And the Sherman's sheer numerical superiority meant that even unfavorable matchups happened rarely. The myth of the Ronson Sherman has actually done a disservice to understanding what made the Sherman effective. It wasn't about being the best individual tank. It was about being part of a system where quantity, reliability, logistics, and tactical flexibility created overwhelming advantage. This brings us to the third major myth, the supposed weakness of Soviet armor. For many years, particularly during the Cold War, Western military analysts emphasized the inferiority of Soviet tanks. This wasn't just technical analysis, it was political. The idea that Soviet equipment was crude, poorly designed, and unreliable fit neatly into Cold War narratives about the superiority of the West. But when you examine Soviet tanks from World War II, particularly the T-34, a very different picture emerges. If you found this breakdown helpful, please like the video. Understanding the real history of these machines is so much more interesting than the myths. The T-34 absolutely revolutionized tank design. Its sloped armor was brilliant. That slope meant that rounds hitting it were more likely to ricochet off rather than penetrate, and it effectively increased armor thickness without adding weight. The gun was well designed and accurate. The transmission and engine, while not without problems, were mechanically sound. Soviet crews by the war's end were experienced and capable. The T-34 forced German designers to completely rethink their approach. The Panther tank was essentially Germany's answer to the T-34, and it incorporated many of the same principles of sloped armor and good gun-to-armor ratios. What created the myth of Soviet inferiority wasn't tank quality. It was battlefield results, or rather, misinterpretation of them. Soviet tank losses were horrific in the early war. But this wasn't primarily because their tanks were bad. It was because their tactics were often poor, their training was inconsistent, and their coordination was chaotic, particularly in 1941 and 1942. A T-34 commanded by an inexperienced crew with poor leadership will lose to a Panzer IV commanded by a veteran crew with good tactics. That's not about the tanks themselves. That's about training and leadership. By 1943 and beyond, as Soviet crews gained experience and Soviet doctrine improved, the effectiveness of Soviet armor increased dramatically. The later Soviet tanks, the T-43 and especially the T-44, showed continued innovation and sophistication. The myth of crude Soviet engineering really says more about Western Cold War biases than it does about the actual machines. Soviet designers understood armor, understood ballistics, and understood what made tanks effective in combat. They made different design choices than Western designers, but those choices weren't inherently inferior. They were sometimes better suited to Soviet manufacturing capabilities and Soviet tactical doctrine. So why do these myths persist so strongly? Part of it is that tanks are fascinating machines, and dramatic stories are more memorable than statistical analysis. The image of a single Tiger holding off an entire company of Shermans is thrilling. It's the kind of story people want to believe and want to repeat. The Ronson myth is funny and memorable. Once it enters popular culture, it becomes part of how people understand the war. The narrative of crude Soviet equipment fit perfectly into Cold War Western ideology. These myths aren't accidents or simple misunderstandings. They're persistent because they're narratively compelling. But here's what the actual evidence shows. The Tiger was impressive but not invincible, and its production numbers never came close to matching Allied output. The Sherman was reliable and versatile, and its effectiveness came from being part of a larger system. not from individual tank superiority. Soviet armor was well-designed and innovative, and its battlefield performance reflected tactical and training factors, rather than inherent inferiority. The real story of World War II tanks is more complex and more interesting than the myths. It's a story about how industrial capacity, logistics, training, doctrine, and tactics all interact with technology to determine outcomes. The Tiger teaches us that individual capability doesn't guarantee battlefield dominance when you're outnumbered and outproduced. The Sherman teaches us that a reliable, maintainable, mass-produced platform can be more effective than a technically superior small production run. The T-34 teaches us that innovation can come from anywhere, and that Soviet engineers were thinking about the same problems in sophisticated ways. Together, they teach us that military history is rarely about clear heroes and villains, superior and inferior designs. It's about complex interactions between technology, human factors, and logistics. If you're interested in real military history, the kind that looks beyond the myths and the legends, please subscribe. And if this exploration of tank warfare has made you think differently about these machines and this war, I'd genuinely love to know which myth surprised you the most to learn was wrong, or which tank do you think was most underrated by history?